Just as a My name is Amy Van Serksum, and I am the new president of the Olympia World Affairs Council. And I want to thank all of you for joining us for this final encore presentation. That's a wonderful addition to our regular speaker series for the year. Just a bit of housekeeping. If those of you who entered and you can see that your video is on, please turn your video off and mute yourself as well so that everyone can have the best possible experience tonight. So I'll start by introducing our special guest today. I want you all to know that due to the format of the program and our short time with half an hour with Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland, we have pre-selected questions that she will be responding to. So as an introduction to our guest, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland represents Washington's 10th Congressional District, which covers parts of Pierce, Thurston, and Mason counties. Prior to her election to Congress, she served as mayor of Tacoma, and she is the first Black American to represent the Pacific Northwest at the federal level, and one of the first Korean American women elected to Congress in its 230-year history. Congresswoman Strickland serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Since taking office, she has worked to make investments in infrastructure and has introduced bipartisan legislation to reduce military hunger, introduced the Puget Save Our Sound SOS Act, and she has voted in support for the American Rescue Plan to bring relief to many Americans. She has also introduced legislation to repeal the harmful Helms Amendment to protect reproductive health rights worldwide. Please welcome Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Amy, and thank you to the World Affairs Council of Olympia for having me here as your guest tonight.
Thank you so much for joining us and for taking this time with us. So I'll launch right into the questions. Our first question for you is, would you share a little bit about your experience as a freshman Congress member?
Great. Well, thank you for that question. And it's interesting, being a freshman in Congress with the backdrop of a pandemic, a failed coup attempt to overturn a legitimate election, and an economic crisis. And, as I think about my introduction to Congress, when you're a freshman, you typically will spend time with other members who are freshmen too, and you do a lot of activities that are social. So, you have events and dinners, you do, trips with your family to different parts of the greater DC area. And we weren't able to do that this year because of the pandemic. So, I've gotten to know people through wearing masks all the time and through Zoom. And so it definitely has a very different feel to it than what you would typically get as a freshman. We were sworn in on the 3rd of January, and it was a joyous occasion. And I wore hanbok, which is a traditional Korean dress that women wear for very special occasions. When babies are 100 years old or have their first birthday, you will see children wearing hanbok. When women get married, sometimes they wear hanbok. So they're for very special occasions. And I wore that dress to honor my mother, and more importantly, to send a message that the US House of Representatives is the people's house, and it belongs to all people. Even someone who's half Black and half Korean who was born in Seoul, even people whose parents may speak with an accent or have a different first language, but really just talking about why this nation belongs to all of us, especially with the backdrop of some of the things that were said and done during the last administration. I often describe my introduction to Congress as 3 Wednesdays. We were sworn in on Sunday, and then a few days later on Wednesday, there was the failed coup attempt to overturn the legitimate election. It was violent, people lost their lives, and I'm still wondering why there are Republicans who simply do not want to do an investigation and an inquiry into what really happened on the 6th of January. The following Wednesday, we filed articles of impeachment because we do believe that Donald Trump was part of what happened. He egged it on, and he was definitely complicit in that horrible event. And then the following Wednesday after that, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were sworn in as president and vice president. So my introduction to Congress has been eventful, to say the least. You know, I've only been there for a few months now. It definitely feels like it's been 2 years already. But at the same time, we've done some remarkable things. We passed the American Rescue Plan, and I was proud to advocate and fight for over $300 billion that went directly to city government, to state government, and to tribal nations, really respecting the fact that those who work locally understand their communities best. And the goal was really simple: getting vaccines into people's arms, getting cash into the hands of people who need it, including small businesses, getting people back to work, and getting students back to school. And if you look at the fact that we now have national leadership when it comes to dealing with the pandemic, we're making progress. There's a lot of work to do still, but I feel very proud of the work we've done so far and look forward to working on the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan.
Great, thank you so much. So our next question is, as a member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, can you share with us some of the national and state priorities you'll be working on? And can you briefly describe how Congress defines infrastructure?
Well, thank you very much for that question. So I am a freshman on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, which is technically an authorizing committee. So we will mark up a budget and submit it to appropriations. And when I think about some of the national and local priorities I'm working on, I think about the 10th Congressional District. And any of us who have spent time trying to navigate the 10th District, whether we are coming or going from Pierce and Thurston counties, we know that there is soul-crushing traffic. That's how I describe it. We've got a giant military base in the middle of the district, and we have a lot of needs. And that's everything from the Nisqually River Bridge to looking at our highways, to looking at adding HOV lanes, the desperate need we have for more transit, and also understanding that if we're going to really reduce climate change, we need a larger electric vehicle infrastructure. Less than 2% of the cars that are sold in America are electric vehicles. And a lot of that is the fact that people aren't familiar with them yet, but a lot of it's also because we don't have the infrastructure that allows you to charge your vehicle if you don't own a 2-bedroom house with a 2-car garage. With that said, I'm also very proud that the Biden administration and House leadership is looking at infrastructure in very holistic terms. So infrastructure is traditionally roads, bridges, mass transit, sewer systems, all incredibly important to our safety and well-being. But we also expanded that definition to include access to broadband, because you need high-speed broadband to fully participate in society and the economy in the 21st century. We've also expanded it to include what we call the caregiving infrastructure. And this is really important because we know that COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women's participation in the workforce. And whether or not it's fair, women are often responsible for caregiving, caring for our youngest and caring for our eldest. And we want to make sure that we're able to provide child tax credits, having paid family leave, and just doing all the things that we know that families need so that we can have a caregiving infrastructure, but also allowing women to fully participate in the workforce. And another part of that that's important too is that women primarily work in the caregiving industries, often women of color. So if we talk about equity and full participation in the economy, we have to take a very holistic view of what infrastructure means. It's our caregiving infrastructure, it is our physical infrastructure, and it's ensuring that every family has access to high-speed broadband so that they can get access to education, voting registration, paying their bills, and even things that are important like telemedicine, especially in rural communities where hospitals are closing.
Thank you. Adam Smith of Washington's 9th Congressional District and chair of the Armed Forces Committee has proposed a bill that would declare that the United States would adopt a no first use policy regarding with regard to nuclear weapons. What are your thoughts on this bill, and how does it impact the work of the House Committee on Armed Services that you serve on?
So as we think about the denuclearization of this world, we have to think of a few things. As we talk about potential conflicts that exist, diplomacy should always be our default position. But I am taking a look at this bill, I'm giving it serious consideration, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that people are staying safe. We want to make sure that we do not get pulled into unnecessary wars, but we also need to make sure that the threat of nuclear annihilation is something that doesn't control how we view foreign policy. You know, we are around the world in many places, and we want to make sure that we're always protecting our interests. But again, diplomacy is always our default position, and we want to make sure that we're being very smart and strategic about it. So I'm taking a serious look at the bill. I will likely support it, but I always have to conduct my due diligence.
Great, thank you. So President Biden has signed the Anti-Asian Hate Crimes Bill. Once it takes effect as law, what education do you think the United States and Washington state need to pursue to make people aware of the law? And are there specific initiatives that you think would have the greatest impact in increasing anti-racist behavior and mindsets here in Washington state and nationally?
Well, thank you for that question. There are a few parts to it. So I want to back up and just really talk about something more in general. So as we look at the rise in anti-Asian violence and some of these tragic killings that have taken place, you know, the Asian American community has been talking about this since 2020. And sadly, there has been a spike in these crimes when COVID hit. And a lot of that has to do with the words and rhetoric coming out of the previous administration, using terms like China flu, Kung flu, and just being flat out racist about it. The other thing that's important to note too is that, you know, violence against Asian Americans or mistreatment is not something that is new to the United States. You know, when this country was formed, I believe that the founding fathers knew that with each successive generation, things would get better and we would try to improve, and we do try to get better. And then there are times when we feel like we move backwards. But, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act was part of this country. The internment of Japanese Americans was part of this country. And then now we're looking at, you know, what's happening with the violence against Asian Americans. So I'd say a few things need to happen. Number one, we need to make the history of Asian Americans in this country part of standard curriculum when we teach US history, because it's a story that it just doesn't get told. And this is not saying that we're trying to erase other parts of history, but typically US history is taught in the context of founding fathers, and that's it. So let's talk about the many contributions that Asian Americans have made to this country. Number two, part of the civics and history lesson is that people don't even know that Asian Americans are not a monolith. We come from many different places. There are at least 40 countries in the diaspora, and just helping people understand the differences between the countries, the differences in the people, and reminding folks that we are as diverse as any other group. And then finally, let me talk a bit about the bill. The COVID-19 Anti-Asian Hate Crime Bill was really created to ensure that the Department of Justice has staff that is going to take these hate crimes seriously and really launch investigations. They're providing tools that will help local government and local law enforcement look into these types of crimes, but also too that reminding folks that even though the anti-Asian hate crimes were the impetus for this, this is going to apply to all hate crimes, so it doesn't exclude anyone. I think that's a really important distinction to make. And we know that since 2020, reports of anti-Asian hate crimes have increased by 150%. I would say another thing that the intention of this bill is to help people feel comfortable reporting the crimes, because we know that these crimes are grossly underreported. And people often don't report them because they're afraid that nothing will happen, that there will be no follow-up. And realistically, it can be hard to prove that hate was the motivation behind a crime unless someone says something overtly. And so this provides a mechanism for accountability. It provides an opportunity to support what local communities are doing. We want people to speak up and speak out when they see these crimes happening, not just as victims, but people who are bystanders. And then finally, we want them to stop.
Thank you. We're actually on to our final question.
Okay.
So we may have time for a couple of other questions from the audience.
All right.
What is your position on authorizing Medicare to bargain for lower prices for prescription drugs?
So, when I was on the campaign trail last year, there were a few issues that came up all the time. And the out-of-pocket cost that people have to pay for prescription drugs probably ranks up there in the top 3. So I do support allowing Medicare to bargain for better drug prices, but I want to make sure that we are not letting other markets around the country dictate what we pay here at home. I remember making phone calls last year, and I ended up calling someone who is a research scientist who does a lot of work in oncology. And we had a very good conversation about prescription drug prices and what goes on. And he just talked about the need to ensure that we are not compromising research and development. He talked about the need to recognize that yes, we pay way too much out of pocket. But for me, what I've learned over this period of time is that we need to negotiate. We need to do it in good faith, and we need to bring all parties to the table. As I think about the priorities that we have when it comes down to getting better prescription drug prices, this is the 117th Congress, and it will be from 2021 to 2022. I don't want to sit here in 2023 saying that we were unable to do anything to reduce out-of-pocket costs for drug prices because we came to a stalemate and we didn't bring everyone to the table. So I fully support allowing Medicare to negotiate drug prices, but I also support being very thoughtful and intentional and finding a way to pass something that's going to get through the House and through the Senate, because we can take victory laps about all the things we pass in the House, but if it ends up in a graveyard in the Senate, then nothing's going to change and nothing becomes law.
Thank you. Now, I am, if you're comfortable with it, I'll ask people to type any questions they may have in the chat box. If you're not familiar with Zoom, typically if you move your mouse over the lower part of your screen, you'll find a little conversation bubble with the word chat under it. If you click on that, you'll be able to type in a message, and we'll be happy to read those. And we have Karen Valenzuela has her hand up. I'm going to unmute her and let her speak. Karen, you're unmuted.
Thank you, Amy. Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Congressmember Strickland, for joining us this evening. I'm the immediate past president of the Olympia World Affairs Council. And while we're waiting for people to type their questions in the chat room, I kind of wanted to hear you comment on your thinking about the recent conviction of Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd, and now the charging of 3 officers in Tacoma for the death of Manuel Ellis, which I believe occurred when you were still mayor there. What are your thoughts about the need for police reform and the effects of police brutality, particularly on communities of color?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. When Derek Chauvin was convicted, I told folks, well, I was in Washington, D.C., and the Congressional Black Caucus actually gathered in a room off of the House floor to watch this verdict come in. It was very nerve-wracking, as you can imagine. And I remember talking to some of my fellow colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus, and I was saying, if this verdict comes in guilty, I'm not going to celebrate. I'm going to feel relieved that the system did exactly what it was supposed to do. So I was mayor of Tacoma from 2010 to 2017. So Manuel Ellis's murder did not happen when I was mayor. But as I think about Bob Ferguson, bringing charges, against 3 officers today, this is the beginning of it. And I tell folks, these are the charging documents, and there's going to be a process that we have to go through. But I do applaud Bob Ferguson, the expert analysts, and the Washington State Patrol for just doing a thoughtful and thorough analysis of what happened. And I know that, the Ellis family, they've been through so much, and for them to have to wait this long to, get something has been very trying on them. But I'm also glad that, the AG did take the time to thoroughly investigate what happened and gather facts. So as I think about, what we do with racially motivated policing or things that happen, I would say a few things. When we think about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that did pass the House of Representatives, it is now sitting in the Senate. And I know that Cory Booker and Tim Scott, 2 African-American men who are in the Senate, are doing their best to try to come up with something so that we can pass it. And just, and I'm going to be introducing something to add to that bill that's going to deal with conflicts of interest, and just ensuring that when we have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, that there won't be conflicts of interest, that there will be opportunities for us to ensure that these investigations are going to take place completely objectively. So I do believe that we can make progress, but I also understand that, these are things that have been embedded in the culture of law enforcement for a very long time. And when I make these comments, this is not anti-policing. Every single person in every single zip code deserves to feel safe, period. And every community wants to be safe. But we have an opportunity here to reimagine policing. We have a chance to rebuild trust between communities and law enforcement, especially communities of color. And we have to recognize that, again, every person wants to be safe. So when we talk about reimagining policing or even police reform, this is not an anti-policing anything. This is a conversation about what it means to be safe in your community. What kind of resources can we provide for people so that if someone doesn't get to the point where their mental health is causing them to do things that are antisocial and even involved, in activity that requires someone to call the cops? What are we doing to ensure that our police academies are providing implicit bias training so that people understand when these biases come up? And what are we doing, obviously to hold people accountable when these crimes happen? And so I think that, it's a very complicated issue. It is very hyper-local, but I also know that the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is a way for the federal government to support what's happening in local law enforcement and have the Department of Justice be a partner to local communities. So that's a very long-winded answer, but it's a very complicated issue. It's complex, it has many layers to it, but I am hopeful that as we move forward with both what happened with Derek Chauvin and then the charging documents that Bob Ferguson released, that we're going to get to a place where we can have some accountability.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a few questions in the chat box. So Karen, if you don't mind taking turns with me, I'll start with the first question. Could you please address specific strategies to address climate change in District 10?
Absolutely. So when we think about climate change, we have to acknowledge that it is a global issue. And, we are lucky that we are in the Pacific Northwest and from the West Coast, where we have a very strong ethos when it comes to our part to address climate change. I'm glad that President Biden has re-entered the Paris Climate Accord, because we know that there are a handful of nations that account for the vast majority of pollution that happens in this world. So what are we doing here at home? As I said earlier, we're doing what we can to invest in mass transit. I was proud to sponsor the Build Housing Near Transit Act, and it was a bipartisan bill that's going to really encourage transit agencies to do feasibility studies to see if we can build housing near transit. It will reduce the amount of time that people spend in cars. It will make public transportation easier and accessible. It's also an issue of equity. The other thing we can do that I talked about earlier was looking at more electric vehicle charging stations so that people who have to drive have options to drive electric vehicles. And then I think the other thing that's important too is just to look at the transportation sector overall. What kind of advances in technology can we take advantage of to reduce our carbon footprint? And how do we make it easier for us as consumers to make better choices that will affect climate change? So those are just some of the things we can do here at home in the 10th District and in Washington State. But I fully acknowledge that Congress is a large body of people, and different people around the country have very different views about climate change. So how do we build a national movement to pass legislation, but understanding that this has to be something that has international support and that we all commit to this together?
And one of our board members is asking, do you think the For the People Act will help reverse the attempts to suppress voter registration and actual voting? Also, what can any of us do to help get that bill passed by both houses?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So there are two bills that can have an impact. There's House Resolution 1, which is the For the People Act. And it has many components. It has a voting rights component, it has a campaign finance reform component, and it deals with, dark money in politics. The HR 4 is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and that is really to address the issue of pre-clearance. And I'm going to get a little technical here, but it ensures that if a state has a history of voter suppression that is often discriminatory and based on race, that any statewide changes to voting rules have to go through the federal government to get clearance. And realistically, I'm not sure about HR 1 passing because of a really, really large bill, but at the same time, we remain optimistic. We have to do what we can to ensure integrity in our elections, but also too, I tell folks that there are 300 bills in play across the United States to suppress voting. The other thing that's important too is that there are secretaries of state now who are Republicans who are being challenged by other Republicans because the people who were in office now dared to say that they wanted free and fair and legitimate elections. And a lot of this is around the fact that Joe Biden won the presidential election. Republicans said it's legit. They've been threatened. And now they have challengers because they want to replace them with other folks who are going to, I would say, compromise some of our elections. And then finally, I want to talk about what happened on January 6th because it's pertinent to this conversation. If you think about the fact that there was a failed coup attempt to overturn legitimate election, people were attacked. There was violence that happened. And the same people who were hunkering down and fearing for their lives and safety turned right around and voted against having a commission to investigate what happened on January 6th. It's mind-boggling, but it raises the issue of who knew what when, who was complicit, and what did they know at the time. And so as I think about the voting rights issue, I feel like it is very comprehensive. And I say that not because I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I say it because it is not far-fetched to think that if the Democrats do not hold on to our majority, because we have a very narrow one right now, if you have secretaries of state around the country who are replacing other secretaries of state, if there's an outcome in the 2024 presidential election and you have people in Congress who don't like the outcome, they could very well decide that they're not going to certify the election. And so when we talk about all these things, democracy is on the line. And I'm not being over dramatic. This is just a clear-eyed view of the possible scenarios that can play out if we are not showing up, if we're not voting, and if we're not finding these laws that try to keep people from the ballot box.
Thank you. I think we have our final question, which may be just perfect timing. And this question is nicely related to our own council here, since we are the Olympia World Affairs Council.
Okay.
It's a question that says, I think you were initially assigned to the Foreign Affairs Committee and then moved to the Armed Services Committee. Why did that change happen?
The change happened because I thought carefully about the district that I represent, and that Joint Base Lewis McChord is the largest military base on the West Coast, right in the middle of my district. I also realized that armed services and foreign affairs actually have quite a bit of intersection. And so when I talked to Chair Gregory Meeks about switching over, he was very supportive of it. He said, I'm losing someone I really want to work with, but we were going to be working together a lot. And it was really important for me as well to be on the House Armed Services Committee because I represent a lot of people who serve in the military and have served. And also I'm the only African-American woman on the House Armed Services Committee. And 40% of the people who are enlisted are people of color, and 20% of people who serve who are enlisted are African-American. As we look at some of the challenges that we have faced in the military with regard to promotion, leadership, discrimination, we want to make sure that we have people there who are calling these things out and really looking at opportunities from a lens of equity. And then finally, the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, is the first African-American to hold that job. And so working with him to make sure that our military is fair, equitable, that we're taking care of the families who serve is really important to me. So I thought it was a good fit for the district, much needed, and wanted to make sure that my voice was there at the table as an African-American woman to serve on this committee.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking our additional questions. I know they weren't planned, and we just so appreciate your time today. We're all excited to have you representing us here in the state of Washington, and we wish you all the best as you move forward doing all of your good work.
Great, and thank you very much for the work that you do. I have a deep affection and appreciation for World Affairs Councils, and I want to make sure that you're able to educate people and just keep us abreast on issues that are important to you here locally that have to do with foreign affairs. So thank you very much for having me as your guest tonight.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for attending.